On the morning of May 11, 2008, U.S. Army Private Second Class Matthew Brown tragically lost his life from a single shot to the head from his own weapon. His death was quickly declared self-inflicted and the case was closed. But several years later, modern technology allowed investigators to take a closer look at the crime scene, and what they found is truly horrifying. Brown was working the 6 a.m. shift alone in the watchtower by the fortified main gate to the base. The tower was known as the Gun Tower. The forward operating base was known as Fob Asadabad. It was a former Soviet stronghold, a grim-looking installation on a shelf above a fast river in the Hindu Kush Mountains near the border with Pakistan. The outer fob contained a helicopter landing zone, munitions and fuel depots, vehicle parking, barracks for Afghan army units, and a bazaar where locals were allowed to sell their goods to the Americans stationed there. The inner fob contained living quarters and offices for hundreds of soldiers and civilian contractors, as well as a small detention center used to hold suspected insurgents before shipping them on for processing elsewhere. Matthew Brown had been plucked from an artillery unit at a distant fire base and assigned to Asadabad to work at the detention center. Like the other low-ranking soldiers there, part of his job was to stand guard in the towers. It was a dull duty. On the morning in question, staying alert was a problem for Brown. Soon after he began his shift, the sergeant of the guard, the man responsible for the soldiers manning the towers and the gates, tried to raise him on the radio. Only after the third attempt did Brown respond intelligibly. The sergeant went to the chow hall to assemble breakfast plates for his crew, then drove to the gun tower, arriving at around 6:25 a.m. He grabbed a Gatorade and Brown's breakfast and shouted up the staircase that he was coming. He heard nothing in response. When he got to the top, he found Brown seated on a high bench at an elevated gun table, but slumped over and leaning against the wall. At first, he thought Brown was sleeping. Then he thought Brown had a bloody nose. Then he saw all the blood on the ground. He set the food and Gatorade on the table and began to tap Brown as if trying to wake him. He then felt his neck for a pulse. Brown was still alive but was breathing shallowly. His weapon was standing on the floor, muzzle up, with the strap loosely around his left leg and a bullet casing laying nearby. The sergeant was not an investigator expected to withhold judgment. He assumed the obvious, that Brown had taken his own life. He radioed to the base office and the medical team, but got no response from either. Finally, he got through to some civilian security contractors working for a company called Cobra. He told them there was an emergency in the gun tower and asked them to send help. By now, Brown had stopped breathing. A man from Cobra soon appeared and felt for a pulse, but couldn't find one. A few minutes later, a doctor arrived on scene and formally declared that Brown had passed away. The doctor was an Army major named Matthew Mayfield. A medic who accompanied him tilted Brown upright on the bench so his wounds could be examined. The entry wound was identified to be a contact wound, which meant the muzzle was placed directly against the skin when it fired. Mayfield laid Brown into an approximation of his original position against the wall for photographic purposes. Later, someone else got him upright again and strapped him to the bench to keep him from sliding under the table. Far to the west, at the Bagram Air Base, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, promised to send investigators. Meanwhile, all sorts of people wandered around the gun tower, disturbing the scene and contaminating the evidence. The only person there with knowledge of normal procedure in such circumstances was a National Guard lieutenant named Brad Faust. In his civilian life, he had been a police officer. So he tried to get people to move away from the scene, but he had no authority over the situation and most people simply ignored him. Later that afternoon, several hours later, the CID investigators had not even boarded a helicopter from Bagram yet, so Brown was placed in a rubberized body bag and carried down the stairs, where he was then loaded into an ambulance and driven to the women's shower room in the inner fob, where he was laid to rest with guards placed outside. That evening, Brown's body was airlifted to Bagram, and then 2 days later, it was delivered to the office of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner. Brown's autopsy concluded with the obvious cause of death. However, where things start to get weird is his blood tests. They showed that Brown had enough of the sedative Valium in his system to render him incapable of coherent action. And just a few days later, the medical examiner officially declared Brown's death to be self-inflicted. But the examiner had very little information to go on since the CID's investigation in Afghanistan had barely even begun at this point. And so, the examiner's ruling didn't account for some of the physical evidence. This is where things start to take a wild turn. 2 weeks before his passing, Brown had visited his mother, Sandra Evans, in Northern California. Brown and his mother were very close, and during his visit, he opened up to her during a long car ride. He told her he did not want to go back to Afghanistan. His problem was not with the enemy, but rather with one of his sergeants, who he described as being a thug. Brown told his mother that the sergeant was running a drug ring, smuggling in prescription narcotics from Pakistan and selling them to the American troops eager to tune out the war. Brown told his mother he had let the sergeant bully him into being the carrier who took the risk of acquiring the narcotics at the bazaar in the outer fob and then carried the contraband past security into the inner fob. Recently, he had told the sergeant he wanted out. The sergeant had refused and had threatened him. As Sandra Evans drove her son to the airport, he told her that he might not return alive. And then just 2 weeks later, he passed away. When CID agents finally got to her door more than a month after Brown's passing, she told them about her son's account of a drug ring at the base, a domineering sergeant, a threat of violence, and his premonition of death. She rejected the medical examiner's finding, not because she thought it was premature, but because she believed her son had been either killed accidentally or murdered. From that day forward, the Army might have considered the possibility that Brown's demise was perhaps not self-inflicted. It could have launched a rigorous investigation, but instead, as the files show, the Army disposed of the case expediently, without following up on many key questions. Sandra Evans wanted answers. She fired off her first letter to the CID 20 days after her son's passing and never let up from there. Her letter-writing campaign widened to include Senator Barbara Boxer, President Obama, and many others. In response to her letters, the Army gave her the brush-off. The CID informed Evans that because the investigation was active, no files could be released. She kept after it anyway. The investigation eventually morphed into a dead-end inquiry into the sale of narcotics at Asadabad. No charges were ever filed, and the investigation was formally closed on February 8, 2009. Several months later, about a year after Brown's passing, the case files from the CID started trickling into Evans' hands. They consisted largely of investigators' logs, along with sworn statements by soldiers on the scene. The files appeared to be disorganized and incomplete. They contained omissions, heavy redactions, and a large number of unexplored contradictions. For a few years, Evans and some of her son's fellow soldiers tried to make sense of them. They marked up the original copies and made a mess of them. Eventually, Evans went online and identified a professional, a lawyer named James Culp, who had an Army background and deep experience with military criminal investigations. When Evans first contacted him, he refused to get involved. She kept at him for 16 months, week after week, until he finally agreed to see her. In 2014, Culp and Evans met at a hotel. Their conversation was long and intense. By the end of it, Culp had agreed to take on the challenge of sorting out the case files, and to do it for free. He did not know what he was getting into. It took him more than 2 years to decipher all the paperwork and redactions. What he found, based on more than 24 witness statements collected by military investigators, their official 17-page report, and a full-scale recreation of the crime scene by independent forensic experts, raises disturbing questions about the CID's investigation into Matthew Brown's death. Brown was not a model soldier. He performed well in the field, but hated physical training and the discipline of garrison life. He lived for the moment and had no sense for value of time. He went AWOL twice and both times binged on cocaine. His first absence lasted several weeks until he tired of partying and reported for duty. His second absence took him to a construction job in Pennsylvania and lasted 3 months until the local police grabbed him and shipped him back to Fort Bragg. The Army then fined him, demoted him back to Buck Private, and gave him the choice of getting kicked out or shipping off to Afghanistan. He chose Afghanistan. 2 days before his passing, Brown was promoted to Private Second Class. He was pleased. He told the sergeant who promoted him that he hoped to rise to the rank of specialist before leaving the Army. He went to the chaplain and asked about the requirements to become a chaplain's assistant. For once, he was planning for sure. For the midnight shift, the normal procedure was to place 2 guards in the gun tower so they could keep each other awake. On the eve of Brown's passing, the 2 guards were friends, Jay Flannery and Aaron Cianfrocco. Both were specialists 2 ranks higher than Brown. Before going on duty that night, they saw Brown at the barracks. They knew he liked to sedate himself with Valium, and Flannery thought he seemed out of it. He yelled at Brown, who had to take the 6 a.m. shift, to go to bed. At 5 a.m., Flannery called someone to wake up Brown. Brown got up, got dressed, and with his right boot unlaced, made his way toward the tower. A sergeant stopped him because he seemed drunk. Brown said that he had just woke up. The sergeant checked to see that his weapon was on safe. He then got close enough to sniff for alcohol and smelled none. Brown continued to the gun tower and got there about 5 minutes late. From the 3rd floor, Flannery shouted at him to hurry up. Flannery yelled at him again when they passed him on the 2nd floor, going down as he was on his way up. Brown simply kept his head down and mumbled something as he went past them. He was severely sedated, far more so than he had been the night before. Flannery and Cianfrocco caught a ride with a sergeant of the guard, who had happened to be passing by. When they got to the barracks, they dumped their gear and briefly discussed the situation. According to their subject's sworn statements, they decided to inform their superior, Sergeant First Class Armando Torres, the MP in charge of the detention center. The time was just after 6 a.m. The next half hour is crucial to the story. The witness statements about events during that short period contain numerous contradictions that the CID investigators failed to explore in their report. Having dropped their gear at the barracks, Specialist Flannery and Cianfrocco found their way to the chow hall. They were there having breakfast with Torres and his deputy, a staff sergeant named Matthew Jackson, when a soldier hurried in around 6:30 and said there was an emergency in the gun tower. Torres and Jackson immediately left for the tower, arriving roughly 3 minutes later. Flannery and Cianfrocco stayed behind to finish their meal. When Torres and Jackson got to the gun tower, the 3rd floor was occupied by the doctor and the medic. Although Torres had no training in such affairs, he seemed now to place himself front and center. He asked Jackson to remain on the 3rd floor to make sure that nothing was touched while he went off to retrieve a camera and report to the company commander. While Torres was gone, Lieutenant Faust, the cop from Virginia, showed up and took notes. The statement he later gave to the CID was the most complete description provided. It included a detail that stands out as especially significant. Faust observed a small hole in a plexiglass window well forward of Brown's body. Of all the witnesses, only Faust mentioned it. He characterized the hole as fragmented and sketched its location in the window pane. It was the sort of hole that a .556 round from an M4 might have made. The CID never performed ballistic or trajectory studies. Subsequent examinations have suggested the hole was in a location unlikely to have resulted from a self-inflicted shot to the head from the muzzle-up weapon loosely strapped around Brown's left leg. When Torres returned with a camera, Faust asked him to excuse himself and withdraw from the scene because of his close ties to the deceased. Standard police procedure. But Torres stayed, saying he had volunteered to Major Mayfield to photograph the scene. Faust told the other soldiers who were now wandering around the 3rd floor to leave until only he, Torres, and Mayfield remained. After Torres finished photographing the scene, Faust escorted him to the base of the tower, leaving only Mayfield inside. Faust put a soldier on guard and gave orders that no one was to enter the tower until the CID agents arrived. But his orders didn't carry any weight, and he left. Torres was not the only military policeman at Asadabad. A group of MPs were helping provide security. They were full-fledged policemen with crime scene training, not primarily jailers like Torres. On the morning of Brown's passing, all of them had departed on missions except for one, a sergeant. When he heard of the trouble, he grabbed his shoulder holster and ran to the tower. According to the CID report, when he got there, he was stopped by Torres, who told him that his assistance was not required. Since Torres outranked him, the MP turned and went away. The company commander, a captain, had ordered Torres to secure Brown's living quarters and to have Flannery and Cianfrocco report to him. Torres found the two soldiers in the inner fob and sent them to see the captain. The captain told them to submit sworn statements, which he loaded onto a thumb drive and retained. Torres's movements over the next few hours are unreported, but by 11:30, when medics strapped Brown to the bench to keep him from sliding onto the floor, Torres was present. A half hour later, when Mayfeld arrived to remove the body, Torres followed him up to the third floor to assist with the job. Extracting Brown from the bench required that his weapon be removed from his leg. Mayfeld took care of it and handed the weapon to Torres, and instructed him to switch its firing selector from semi to safe. Torres did more than that. Having rendered the weapon safe, he disappeared with it to the tower's second floor to clear it. Wearing rubber gloves, he dropped the magazine, ejected a round from the firing chamber, and checked the chamber to verify that it was empty. He then reloaded the ejected round into the magazine and clicked the magazine back into place. Investigators later questioned why he had taken the weapon to the second floor to clear it. He explained that he wanted to minimize the risk of people on the floor above. The investigators did not challenge his logic. Torres then returned Brown's M4 to the third floor. But 3 months later, an Army forensics laboratory in Georgia found no fingerprints on the weapon. It is impossible to know whether it had been wiped down, but it was not tested for DNA, and Brown's hands were found to have no gunpowder residue on them. According to Jackson's sworn statement, he and Torres had lunch, and then, contrary to common sense and crime scene norms, they returned to the gun tower and spent 15 minutes inside alone. Jackson said they looked for the bullet and ricochet marks. He did not say why. To any competent investigator, this statement alone should have set off alarms, but the CID agents never followed up on it, and Torres never mentioned the visit at all. The CID agents arrived around 2 p.m. on the day of Brown's passing. There were 2 of them, and their names have been blacked out in the files. Torres was the first person with direct involvement that they spoke to. He informed them that Brown had shot himself. He said he had taken pictures and that Brown's body had been removed, his weapon had been cleared, and the crime scene had been disturbed by medical personnel. He also said incorrectly that he was the only MP currently on the base. The agents got to the gun tower at 2:45, and for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes, they performed a detailed examination of the third floor, including mapping the locations of the blood and taking measurements of the gun table, the chair, and the window. Nothing in that room was supposed to escape their attention, but they were unable to find the bullet or fragments of it, even when they returned the following morning with a metal detector. On some of the simplest matters involved in detailing a crime scene, they made fundamental errors. They got the dimensions of the gun table wrong. This was an important miscalculation because it allowed for subsequent miscalculations to stand. Furthermore, when the agents came to the hole in the plexiglass window that Lieutenant Faust clearly described as fragmented, one of them wrote, "Based upon the point of impact, possible trajectory of the projectile, the size of the hole in the plexiglass, and the lack of cracks or stress marks around the hole, it did not appear as though the hole was made by a small arms round." And that was it. They never returned to the subject. Even after Faust, their fellow policeman, submitted his observations. And 10 years later, under pressure from James Culp, the CID produced photographs from the files that clearly showed a fractured and splintered hole. After inspecting the tower, the agents went to Brown's quarters, a scene that had been secured by Torres. There, in a plastic bag, they found 12 empty blister packs, each of which had contained 10 milligram pills of Valium. The discovery was significant. This was a high-quality industrial product that was coming across the nearby border, and it was suggested access to more than an artisanal level of Pakistani narcotics. 3 more blister packs appeared during a second search the following afternoon. The military suspected that someone at the base was providing soldiers with an ample supply of drugs. Later that year, Culp was told the CID formally named 2 unidentified soldiers as suspects in a drug operation at Asadabad. After one of the soldiers invoked his right to legal counsel, however, the initiative was dropped. The optics would certainly have been bad for the army. Asadabad as a staging point for Pakistani narcotics flowing unchecked to US troops throughout Afghanistan. On the base, Valium abuse was so widespread that a few months after Brown's passing, all 120 soldiers were quietly pulled from their individual barracks and forced to sleep in open bays to deprive them of privacy for the remainder of their tour. However Matthew Brown died, the existence of a drug ring at Asadabad could have provided a motive to kill him. He was unreliable, a whiner who wanted out, a courier who knew all sides, a kid getting high on his own supply. On the morning of his death, his condition in the gun tower could have landed him in the hospital, where questions would have been raised, and he might have begun to talk. Though none of this proves that Brown was murdered, the inner life of even those closest to us can be secret, and some people do take their own lives without warning. It is completely possible that Brown took his own life. It is also possible that everything Brown told his mother about the drug ring was untrue, and that Torres and Jackson were guilty of nothing more than inadvertently violating standard crime scene protocols. The point is not that we know Brown was killed. The point is that we cannot be certain how he died, because the CID investigators seem barely to have considered any possibility other than self-inflicted, even after they stumbled upon evidence of a drug problem at Asadabad. Their greatest concerns appeared to be Brown's habitual drug use and the strange disappearance of his wallet. It was not found after careful searches of his quarters and the tower, as well as 2 searches of his body. Yet, it mysteriously materialized inside the body bag after it arrived at Bagram. Perhaps someone was worried about what it might contain. Jackson had accompanied Brown's body on the flight from Asadabad. The investigators questioned him but drew no larger conclusions and ultimately shrugged it off. Later, when Senator Barbara Boxer inquired about the missing wallet, the Army told her incorrectly that the CID agents had found it as soon as they arrived at Asadabad. Even more troubling, the sworn statements are full of material omissions and contradictions when it comes to where the 4 main witnesses were during the critical half hour between 6 a.m. and 6:30. Flannery gave 2 accounts of the same story. The first, contained in the sworn statement gathered by Torres, Flannery stated that he and Cianfrocco spotted Torres in the chow hall and informed him of Brown's tardiness and appearance, and that Torres said he would check on Brown after he finished his breakfast. The second was a different version that Flannery gave the following day directly to the CID. It added what turns out to be an important detail. On the way to the chow hall, he and Cianfrocco briefly stopped by the base's recreation center to get some information from the internet. He stated that they then proceeded to the chow hall, where they joined Jackson and Torres for breakfast, not mentioning Brown at all. And we don't even know the content of Cianfrocco's initial statement for the simple reason it was on the thumb drive retained by Torres, who later told the investigators that it had been corrupted. It is hard to understand why a timeline that should have been simple became so complicated. The CID failed to resolve even the most glaring contradictions in the accounts of the 4 main witnesses. A decade after Brown's death, a forensic company called Visual Evidence tried to piece the puzzle together. Visual Evidence is based in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. It is in the legal support business and offers a variety of services, including crime scene recreations that can withstand cross-examination in court. The company decided to take on the Brown inquiry pro bono, having heard about Sandra Evans' quest from a forensics and blood spatter expert who was looking into the case. Working with the CID's measurements, the team built a full-scale replica of the crime scene, including the elevated bench and table, the plexiglass window, and the bloodstains on the walls and ceiling. They used a replica M4 and various lasers and aiming devices. At the same time, they began to produce computer-generated images of the possible ballistics. They did not set out to prove a theory, but to explore the physical realities of the crime scene as best could be reconstructed. As they progressed, it began to seem that the only way to duplicate the shot that fit the evidence provided was to have Brown rest his head on the table as if unconscious, with the shot being fired by someone else from an angle that Brown could not have achieved. Some important questions remained unanswered. In a small concrete room, why had no bullet or bullet fragments been found? And what was the cause of the hole in the plexiglass window? Given the dimensions of the gun table, the hole appeared to be too far forward to have resulted from any of the possible trajectories. Nonetheless, visual evidence began to lean toward a conclusion of murder. A scenario that fit the laboratory's reconstruction was this. A killer came up the stairs in the rear of the room, observed Brown passed out on Valium with his head on the table, retrieved Brown's weapon from somewhere in the room, racked around into the chamber, switched from safe to semi, placed the muzzle against Brown's head from a position slightly below and to the right, and fired a single round. In this scenario, the killer would then have to put Brown's left leg through the strap, lowered the weapon stock to the floor, and immediately departed. It would have been a sloppy plan, hastily executed. If that is what happened, the salvation for the killer was that the CID was even. Thanks to the attention that attorney James Culp has paid to Matthew Brown's case, the CID agreed to a meeting to hear him out. The original files were brought in for the occasion. They included crime scene photographs that had been previously kept under wraps. The meeting took place over 5 hours on the afternoon of April 12th at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia. The CID was represented by 2 agents and a lawyer. Culp was joined by experts from visual evidence. The meeting did not go well. Culp felt that the senior CID agent adopted a patronizing tone, lecturing him on the messiness of the perceptions and the unreliability of the eyewitnesses. For every question Culp raised, the agents offered a dismissive answer. He did not, however, confirm that the CID had failed to conduct a quality assurance audit of the investigation, rendering its process and findings even more suspect. And the new crime scene photographs shared by the CID revealed that the original investigators had grossly miscalculated the dimensions of the elevated table in the gun tower, overstating its depth by 18 inches. This meant that Brown had been sitting 18 inches forward of the position that the visual evidence had been working with. When the company's technicians rearranged the mock-up in Ohio to reflect the new information, they found that Brown's entry and exit wounds now lined up precisely with the splintered hole in the window. The CID promised to get back to Culp once a decision had been made on the merits of his position, but 6 weeks passed in silence. Then, one day after being contacted by Vanity Fair, the CID called Sandra Evans and informed her that her investigation was being reopened. At first glance, the news was heartening, but Culp was wary. After decades of experience with the CID, he suspected that the investigation might be a ploy meant to deflect criticism and justify their original findings. In fact, the CID closed the reinvestigation after only 4 weeks. It declined to discuss whom it had interviewed or what it had found, saying only that Brown's mother was free to request the files under the Freedom of Information Act, and those files will of course be redacted. Soon after the reinvestigation into Matthew Brown's passing was closed, Culp received a copy of a missing statement by Michael Merritt, in which he testified that Torres had known about Brown's passing before he was notified of it in the chow hall. Merritt has left the Army and lives in Florida now. Culp got through to him easily by phone and told him that the reinvestigation had come and gone. This was news to Merritt, who said that no one from the CID had contacted him. If they had, they would have learned what Merritt volunteered to Culp, that he had kept a daily diary in Afghanistan and that he still has this diary today, and it contains notes expressing confusion about certain aspects of Brown's passing. According to Merritt, Jackson ordered him to stand guard at the base of the gun tower at around 7:45 a.m. He was present when Brown's body was removed and was still there when Torres and Jackson returned at around 12:15 p.m. and entered the tower alone. Merritt thought their visit was odd and wondered what the purpose was. They were still inside 45 minutes later when Merritt was relieved by none other than Cianfrocco and Flannery. In his official statement, Jackson had said that he and Torres had been inside the guard tower for 15 minutes, But now we have Merritt recalling that the visit was at least 3 times longer than that. It is hard to know what to make of this, but the CID made nothing of it at all because they never bothered to ask. Soldiers who die in combat zones deserve at the very least a competent investigation into the causes of their deaths. But that is unfortunately something Matthew Brown will likely never get. He may have taken his own life, or he may have been murdered. And short of accepting the CID's authority, there is no way to know. But given all of the evidence displayed in this video, I want to hear what you guys think down in the comment section below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to click on my Patreon link down in the description for uncensored footage. And be sure to check out this video linked on screen right now for more content just like this.